In the dusty Arizona territory of 1883, a solitary Apache warrior named Takoda lives in self-imposed exile in the barren hills, haunted by a past that cost him everything he loved. Known as the Ghost by locals, he's a legend whispered about in saloons, a man who appears from nowhere to deliver swift, silent justice before vanishing into the desert wind. When 10-year-old Sarah Mitchell comes running up the rocky trail to his isolated camp, tears streaming down her dirt-stained face, screaming that 4 cowboys have stolen her mother, Takoda faces a choice that will either redeem his soul or damn it forever. What begins as a rescue mission transforms into a deadly game of cat and mouse across the unforgiving landscape, where Takoda must confront not only the ruthless outlaws, but also the demons of his own past. As secrets unravel and the truth behind the kidnapping emerges, Takoda discovers that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with the courage to love again and the strength to forgive. In a heart-stopping climax that will test every skill he possesses and every shred of humanity he has left, the Ghost must choose between vengeance and redemption, between death and life, between the warrior he was and the man he could become. The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, like a bleeding wound, painting the sandstone cliffs in shades of crimson and gold. The heat still radiated from the red earth, even as evening approached, making the air shimmer and dance above the cracked ground. In the distance, a dust devil spiraled upward, a dancing ghost in the fading light. This was a land that killed the weak and hardened the strong, a place where water was more precious than gold, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Takoda sat motionless on a flat boulder, overlooking the vast expanse of desert below, his weathered face as still as the ancient rock formations surrounding him. His long black hair, streaked with premature silver, hung loose around his shoulders, moving slightly in the hot breeze. Deep brown eyes, the color of the earth itself, scanned the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a predator. At 42 years old, his body was lean and hard as ironwood, marked by scars that told stories he would never speak aloud. He wore simple buckskin pants and a faded blue shirt that had once belonged to someone else, someone from a life he could barely remember now. The small fire beside him crackled softly, barely more than embers now, the smoke rising straight up in the still air. A rabbit, skinned and spitted, roasted slowly over the flames. His horse, a paint stallion named Spirit, grazed nearby on the sparse desert grass, occasionally lifting his head to test the wind. This had been Takoda's routine for 5 years now. Hunt, eat, sleep, survive, nothing more. He had learned to exist in the spaces between heartbeats, to find peace in the absolute silence of solitude. But the desert was never truly silent if you knew how to listen. Takoda heard the approaching footsteps long before most men would have detected anything unusual. They were light, frantic, stumbling, not the calculated steps of a hunter or the measured pace of a traveler who knew the land. These were the desperate footfalls of someone running for their life, someone small. He remained perfectly still, letting his eyes do the searching rather than turning his head. In the gathering dusk, movement drew predators, both animal and human. Then he heard it, a sound that pierced through his carefully constructed wall of indifference like an arrow through paper. The crying of a child. Raw, terrified, exhausted, crying that spoke of horror, witnessed and innocence shattered. Takoda's jaw tightened imperceptibly. In 5 years of isolation, he had trained himself not to feel, not to care, not to get involved. The world had taken everything from him, and in return, he had given the world his back. But that sound, that desperate, heartbroken sobbing, ignited something in his chest that he thought had died with his own family. The girl appeared at the crest of the hill like an apparition, her small frame silhouetted against the burning sky. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with tangled blonde hair that caught the last rays of sunlight like spun gold. Her blue dress was torn and filthy, covered in dust, and what looked like dried blood, though Takoda's experienced eye told him it probably wasn't hers. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, and her small hands were scraped raw. She stumbled, nearly fell, caught herself, and kept running toward his camp with the single-minded desperation of a drowning person reaching for a rope. "Please," she screamed, her voice cracking with exhaustion and terror. "Please, you have to help. They took her. They took my mama." She was perhaps 50 yards away now, her small legs pumping frantically, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Takoda could see the white rings of fear around her eyes, the way her whole body shook with each step. This child had been running for a long time, pushing herself far beyond what her small body should have been able to endure. Whatever had happened to her, whatever she had witnessed, had given her the strength of pure terror. Takoda rose slowly to his feet, his movements fluid and controlled. He raised one hand in a gesture meant to calm, to show he meant no harm. The girl saw him properly for the first time, and faltered in her steps, suddenly uncertain. He knew what she saw. A tall, dark-skinned man, with long hair and eyes that had seen too much death. In this territory, Apache warriors were both feared and respected, and not all encounters ended peacefully. But the child had nowhere else to go, no other hope to cling to. After a moment's hesitation, she continued forward, her need greater than her fear. She collapsed at his feet, her small hands clutching at his buckskin pants as she gasped for air. Her whole body was trembling, and Takoda could feel the heat of fever radiating from her skin. The girl had pushed herself to the brink of heat stroke in her desperate flight. He knelt down slowly, making himself less imposing, and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away, too exhausted to do anything but cling to this stranger who represented her only hope. "Water," Takoda said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another human being in weeks. He moved to his supplies and retrieved his canteen, carefully lifting it to her lips. "Slow," he instructed as she tried to gulp desperately. "Small sips, or you'll be sick." The girl nodded, forcing herself to drink slowly, even though every fiber of her being wanted to drain the canteen dry. Takoda watched her carefully, his mind already calculating distances, time, possibilities. Whatever had happened, it had happened recently. The girl's terror was too fresh, her desperation too raw. When she had drunk enough, he pulled the canteen away gently and handed her a piece of dried meat from his pack. "Eat," he commanded softly, "then talk." The girl took the meat with shaking hands, her eyes never leaving his face, as if afraid he might disappear if she looked away. She chewed mechanically, her body beginning to respond to basic needs even as her mind remained locked in whatever nightmare she had fled from. Takoda settled back on his haunches, waiting with the infinite patience of a hunter. He had learned long ago that rushing the traumatized only made things worse. The girl needed these few moments to gather herself, to find her voice again. He studied her more carefully now, noting details that told him more than words could. The dress, though filthy and torn, was well made. This was no frontier urchin, but a child from a family of some means. Her boots, though scuffed, were good leather and fit properly. There was a delicate silver locket around her neck, still intact, despite her ordeal. But most telling were her hands, soft, uncalloused, the hands of a child who had been protected from hard labor, loved and cared for. Until today. "My name is Sarah," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "Sarah Mitchell. My mama is Emily Mitchell. We were traveling from Tucson to Phoenix. Papa died last year from the fever, and Mama said we had to start over. Find a new life." Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, cutting clean lines through the dirt. "We hired 4 men escort us to keep us safe. Mr. Donovan said he knew the trail, said he'd protect us." Her voice broke on the word, and Takoda saw her small hands clench into fists. But Takoda waited, his face impassive, but his eyes intent. He had heard similar stories before, knew how this tale usually unfolded. The frontier was full of predators who wore human faces, who saw vulnerable women and children as opportunities rather than people deserving protection. The rage that had been dormant in his chest for 5 years began to stir, a sleeping dragon, opening one red eye. They stopped the wagon at noon. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, as if speaking the horror aloud somehow made it more bearable. Said we needed to rest the horses, but then Mr. Donovan, he grabbed Mama, and the others, they just laughed. Mama told me to run, screamed at me to run and hide. So I did. I ran into the rocks, and I hid, and I watched. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I watched them tie her up and throw her in the back of the wagon. They took everything, our money, our belongings, everything, and then they took Mama. How long ago? Takoda asked, his voice still quiet but with an edge now, like a blade being drawn from a sheath. Sarah looked up at the darkening sky, trying to calculate time when her whole world had become timeless horror. Maybe 6 hours. The sun was high when it happened. I ran after them for a while, but they were too fast. Then I saw the smoke from your fire, and I kept running toward it. I didn't know what else to do. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength for such a small, exhausted child. Please, mister. Please help my mama. They're bad men. Mr. Donovan, he has eyes like a snake. The other 3, they do whatever he says. One is big and mean-looking, one has a scar across his face. And the last one, he kept laughing. Even when Mama was crying, he kept laughing. Takoda felt something cold settle in his stomach. 6 hours. In 6 hours, men with a captive woman could get far, especially if they knew someone might follow. They could also do unspeakable things. He pushed that thought aside. It would not help the child or the mother to dwell on possibilities. What mattered now was the trail, the pursuit, the hunt. These were things he understood, things he was good at. Better than any man alive. Some said, better than any man should be. Others whispered. Did they see you? He asked. Do they know you escaped? Sarah shook her head emphatically. I don't think so. I heard Miss Donovan tell the others that I probably died in the desert. He said it didn't matter anyway, that nobody would believe a child even if I did survive to tell someone. Her young face hardened with a fury that seemed far too old for her years. But I'll make them believe. I'll make everyone believe. They can't just take people's mamas and get away with it. Takoda studied the child's face, the determination in those blue eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she had survived the unsurvivable through sheer will. She reminded him of someone he had lost in fire and screaming and blood. He pushed that memory down, locked it away in the deep places of his mind, where all his ghosts lived. This was not the time for remembering. This was the time for hunting. Which direction, he asked simply. Sarah pointed northwest, toward the Badlands, toward the rough country where the law rarely ventured, and outlaws could disappear for months or even years. Takoda's jaw tightened. Of course they had gone that way. Men like these always went where civilized society feared to follow, but they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed the desert would kill the child. They had assumed no one would care enough to follow. They had assumed wrong. Can you ride? Takoda asked, already moving to gather his meager supplies. Everything about him had changed in an instant, the contemplative stillness replaced by purposeful action, the resigned isolation transformed into focused determination. Sarah watched him, hope beginning to bloom in her chest like a desert flower after rain. Yes, sir, she answered. Mama taught me. She said every girl should know how to ride and shoot, just in case. Takoda allowed himself the ghost of a smile at that. A wise woman, this Emily Mitchell. He hoped he would have the chance to tell her so in person. He quickly doused the fire, scattering the embers and covering them with sand. No sense advertising their position or their intentions. Spirit, sensing the change in his master's demeanor, trotted over without being called, ready for whatever came next. The paint stallion had been Takoda's companion for 3 years, had carried him through countless dangers, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of threat and safety. Takoda swung into the saddle with fluid ease and reached down to pull Sarah up behind him. She settled against his back, her small arms wrapping around his waist. He could feel her trembling, whether from exhaustion, fear, or cold as the desert night approached. He couldn't tell. Probably all three. "Hold tight," he instructed. "We ride through the night." He paused, then added quietly, "Your mother's name is Emily." "Yes, sir," Sarah whispered against his back. "Then we will find Emily," Takoda said with absolute certainty. It was the first promise he had made to another human being in 5 years. It was a promise he intended to keep, no matter what it cost him. And the men who took her will answer for what they've done. As he urged Spirit forward into the gathering darkness, following a trail that only his trained eyes could detect in the fading light, Takoda felt the old familiar weight of purpose settling onto his shoulders. He had been the ghost for 5 years, a specter haunting the margins of civilization, neither living nor dead. But now, with a child's desperate plea ringing in his ears and the scent of injustice sharp in his nostrils, he felt something long dormant, stirring within him. The Apache warrior was riding again, and somewhere out in the darkness, 4 men had just made the last mistake of their lives. The desert night transformed the landscape into an alien world of silver and shadow. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light for Takoda to follow the trail, while Spirit picked his way carefully through the rocky terrain. Sarah had fallen into an exhausted sleep against his back, her small body finally surrendering to the ordeal she had endured. Takoda could feel her weight shift slightly with each of Spirit's steps, but her arms remained locked around his waist even in sleep, as if her subconscious refused to let go of her only protection. They had been riding for 3 hours when Takoda spotted the first real sign, a broken branch on a creosote bush, snapped at a height that indicated a wagon wheel had passed too close. He dismounted silently, careful not to wake the child, and examined the ground with the practiced eye of a tracker who could read the earth like other men read books. 4 sets of hoof prints, relatively fresh, the impressions deep enough to suggest riders moving at a steady pace, but not hurrying. They felt safe, these men. They thought themselves beyond pursuit, beyond justice. Takoda's fingers traced the edge of one hoof print, feeling the slight crumbling of disturbed sand at the edges. 4 hours old, maybe 5. He was gaining on them faster than he had expected, but that made sense. They had a wagon, and wagons moved slowly through this terrain, especially at night. They would have to stop soon, make camp, rest their horses. Men like these grew careless when they thought they were safe. It was a mistake Takoda had seen countless times before, a mistake that often proved fatal. He returned to Spirit and mounted again, and they continued into the night. The trail led northwest as Sarah had indicated, deeper into the Badlands where the land grew harsh and unforgiving. Ancient mesas rose like dark sentinels against the star-scattered sky, and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain that might never fall. This was country Takoda knew well. He had spent the last 5 years learning every canyon, every water source, every hiding place in these vast stretches of wilderness. If the outlaws thought the Badlands would protect them, they were about to learn how wrong they were. Around midnight, Sarah stirred awake with a small gasp of fear. "It's all right," Takoda said quietly, his voice steady and calm. "You're safe. We're still following the trail." He felt her relax slightly, though her grip on him didn't loosen. "There's a stream about an hour ahead. We'll stop there briefly, let you rest properly, and let Spirit drink. Then we continue." "Have you found them?" Sarah asked, her voice still thick with sleep and hope. "Not yet, but they're not as far ahead as they think. Their tracks are fresh. They believe they're safe out here." Takoda paused, then added, "They're wrong." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then asked in a small voice, "Are you going to kill them?" It was a child's question, but asked with an understanding beyond her years. Takoda considered his answer carefully. He had killed before in Iraq, in defense, in the execution of justice, where the law could not reach. Each death weighed on him differently, some heavy as stones, others light as dust. But he had learned long ago that lies, especially to children, always caused more harm than truth. "I will do what must be done to bring your mother back safely," he finally answered. "If they surrender peacefully, I will bring them to the law. If they fight," he let the sentence hang unfinished in the night air. Sarah seemed satisfied with this answer, or perhaps she was too young to fully comprehend what it meant. Either way, she laid her head against his back again, and didn't ask any more questions. They reached the stream as Takoda had predicted, a thin ribbon of water that flowed year-round from a spring hidden somewhere in the rocks above. Spirit drank deeply while Takoda helped Sarah down from the saddle. She could barely stand, her legs stiff from hours of riding, and her body demanding rest that couldn't yet be given. Takoda filled the canteen and made her drink again, then had her eat more dried meat and some pemmican he carried for long journeys. "Tell me about your mother," Takoda said as she ate. It wasn't just conversation he needed to know about. Emily Mitchell needed to understand what kind of woman he was tracking these men to save. Details mattered in situations like this. They could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah's face softened at the question, some of the fear and exhaustion giving way to love and memory. "Mama's strong," she began, and Takoda noticed she used the present tense, refusing to consider any other possibility. "After Papa died, everyone said we should go back east, back to her family. But Mama said we were Western women now, that we didn't run from hard times. She learned to shoot Papa's rifle, learned to handle the wagon team by herself. She can cook better than anyone, and she sings sometimes when she works. She has brown hair like autumn leaves and green eyes that look like the forest we used to live near before we came west." Takoda listened carefully, filing away every detail. Strong-willed, determined, resourceful, Emily Mitchell would fight to survive, would look for opportunities to escape. That was good. It meant she might still be alive when he caught up to them, might have even made things difficult for her captors. But it also meant they might hurt her, might break that spirit to make her more manageable. The thought made his jaw clench, and he forced himself to remain calm, to think clearly. "She's 32, Sarah continued, warming to her subject. "She says that's young enough to start over, but old enough to be smart about it. She wanted to open a boarding house in Phoenix, use some of the money Papa left us to build something new. She said hard work never killed anyone, and that dignity came from honest labor." The girl's voice broke slightly. "She's a good mama. The best mama. She doesn't deserve what those men did to her." "No," Takoda agreed quietly. "She doesn't." He stood and began preparing Spirit for the continuation of their journey. The brief rest had been necessary, but dawn was still hours away, and he wanted to cover as much ground as possible under the concealment of darkness. "We ride again. By sunrise we'll be close enough to see their camp smoke if they're foolish enough to light a fire." As he lifted Sarah back onto the horse, she asked suddenly, "What's your name? I told you mine, but you never said yours." Takoda paused. His name, his real name, was tied to a life he had left behind, a man he no longer was. For 5 years, he had been the ghost, the shadow, the nameless tracker who appeared and disappeared like morning mist. But this child deserved better than a phantom. She deserved to know who was risking his life to save her mother. "Takoda," he said finally. "It means friend to everyone in my language, though I have not lived up to that name for many years." "I think you're living up to it now," Sarah said with the simple certainty of a child. "You're my friend, and Mama's too, even though she doesn't know it yet." Something in Takoda's chest twisted at those words, something that felt dangerously close to the emotion he had spent 5 years burying. He said nothing, just swung into the saddle and urged Spirit forward into the darkness. But as they rode, he found himself thinking about the name his mother had given him, about what it meant to be a friend to everyone, about whether redemption was possible for a man who had willingly become a ghost. The hours passed in focused silence as Takoda followed the trail with unwavering precision. The landscape gradually began to change as they moved deeper into the Badlands. The flat desert gave way to broken country arroyos and gullies carved by flash floods, rock formations that jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and narrow canyons that could hide 1,000 secrets. This was outlaw country, the kind of place where wanted men disappeared, and honest folks knew better than to venture without good reason. But Takoda had the best reason of all. As the first hint of gray appeared on the eastern horizon, announcing the coming dawn, Takoda spotted something that made him slow spirit to a careful walk. In the distance, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, was a thin wisp of smoke rising from behind a rocky outcropping. His eyes narrowed. They had made camp and built a fire, confident that no pursuit would find them in this desolate place. It was the arrogance of men who had gotten away with evil before, who believed themselves untouchable. "I see it," Sarah whispered, having spotted the smoke as well. Her body tensed against his back, fear and hope warring within her. "Is that them?" "Most likely," Takoda replied, his voice barely audible. "We'll leave Spirit here and approach on foot. I need to see their camp, count their numbers, assess the situation." He found a sheltered spot among some rocks and dismounted, helping Sarah down. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Can I come with you?" she asked, though her voice trembled with fear at the prospect. Takoda shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. You stay here with Spirit. He'll protect you if anything goes wrong." He saw the protest forming on her lips and added, "Your mother needs me to be smart about this, not reckless. I need to know what we're facing before I act. That means moving quietly, staying hidden. I can't do that properly if I'm worried about keeping you safe." Sarah nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic even if she didn't like it. "You'll come back?" she asked, in a small voice. "I'll come back," Takoda promised. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard on the saddle and checked the ammunition. 6 rounds in the Winchester, a Colt revolver on his hip, with 6 more, and a knife that had tasted blood more times than he cared to remember. Not overwhelming firepower against 4 armed men. But Takoda had learned long ago that preparation and precision mattered more than ammunition count. He looked down at Sarah, this brave child who had survived the unsurvivable, who had run through the desert night on nothing but determination and love for her mother. "Whatever happens, whatever you hear, you stay hidden until I come back or until you're sure it's safe. Understand?" Sarah nodded solemnly, and Takoda could see the weight of adult understanding settling onto her young shoulders. The frontier had a way of forcing children to grow up fast. "Good girl." With that, Takoda melted into the pre-dawn shadows, moving with the fluid silence of a predator. He had been trained by the best trackers and warriors of his people, had learned to move across the land without leaving a trace, to become one with the earth and sky. For 5 years he had honed these skills in solitude, practicing the ancient arts until they were as natural as breathing. Now, as he approached the outlaw camp, every lesson, every instinct, every hard-won skill came flooding back. The camp was situated in a natural hollow between 2 rock formations, chosen for its concealment and protection from the wind. As Takoda crept closer, using every shadow and outcropping for cover, he began to make out details. 4 horses picketed near the remains of the wagon they had stolen, or rather 3 horses and a mule. The wagon itself had been partially unloaded, their stolen goods scattered carelessly around the camp. These weren't professional outlaws, Takoda realized. Professional criminals would have been more organized, more cautious. These were opportunists, men who had seen a chance for easy money and an easier victim, and had taken it without thought for consequences. That made them more dangerous in some ways. Professionals could be predicted, reasoned with, sometimes even negotiated with. But men like these, driven by base impulses and assumed immunity from justice, were unpredictable. They might kill Emily Mitchell on a whim, or out of fear when confronted, or simply because they could. Takoda would have to be very careful, very precise. He circled the camp slowly, using the growing light to his advantage. Dawn was perhaps 20 minutes away, and in the grey pre-dawn, shadows could play tricks on the eyes. He counted the men, 4, as Sarah had said. 3 were sleeping around the dying fire, wrapped in bedrolls and snoring softly. The 4th, a man with a distinctive scar across his face, visible even in the dim light, sat with his back against a rock, supposedly on watch, but clearly fighting sleep. His head kept drooping forward, then jerking back up as he tried to stay alert. And there, tied to a wagon wheel with thick rope, was Emily Mitchell. Even in the poor light, even from a distance, Takoda could see she had fought them. Her dress was torn more extensively than Sarah's had been, and there were dark marks on her face that were probably bruised. Her brown hair had come loose from whatever pins had held it, and hung in tangled waves around her face. But her eyes, even from here, Takoda could see they were open, alert, watching her captors with the focused intensity of a woman planning her survival or her revenge. She was alive, beaten, terrorized, but alive. Relief washed through Takoda, followed immediately by a cold, calculating fury. These men had taken this woman from her daughter, had brutalized and terrified her, had stolen her dignity and her future. They had created an orphan in all but name, had shattered a child's world. For that they would answer. But first, he needed a plan. 4 men, 3 sleeping but they could wake in an instant. 1 on watch, armed and alert enough to be dangerous even in his exhausted state. Emily tied up, and unable to run, even if he created a diversion. The odds weren't good for a frontal assault, especially not if he wanted to ensure Emily's safety. A stray bullet in a firefight could end the very life he was trying to save. No, this required subtlety. This required becoming the ghost again. Takoda began to formulate his strategy as the first true rays of sunlight broke over the eastern horizon, painting the Badlands in shades of orange and gold. The day was coming, and with it, the reckoning these 4 men had unknowingly called down upon themselves. They had hurt a child and stolen a mother, and now they would learn that in this vast, empty desert, there was still justice to be found. And it was coming for them on silent feet, with ancient eyes and a warrior's heart, driven by a little girl's desperate plea. And a promise made under a bleeding sky. Takoda remained motionless in his concealed position, watching the camp with the patience of a hunting hawk. The sun continued its ascent, and with each passing moment, the details of the scene before him became clearer, more defined, more damning. The man on watch, the one with the scar, finally lost his battle with exhaustion and slumped against the rock, his rifle sliding from his lap to rest against his leg. Even from 50 yards away, Takoda could hear the faint sound of snoring joining the chorus from the other 3 men. This was the moment. 4 sleeping men, their guard down, their weapons within reach, but not in hand. Emily Mitchell remained tied to the wagon wheel, but Takoda could see now that she was watching the camp with the same intensity he was. A survivor. He thought again. A fighter. That would make things easier, or it would make them more complicated, depending on how she reacted when he appeared. He began his approach with infinite care, placing each foot with deliberate precision, testing the ground before committing his weight. The sand and gravel that covered much of the terrain could betray even the most careful tracker with a misplaced step. Takoda moved like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance, using every rock, every shadow, every slight depression in the land to mask his advance. It took him nearly 15 minutes to cover the 50 yards to the camp's perimeter, but when he arrived at the edge of the hollow where they had made camp, he was as invisible as morning mist. Now came the delicate part. Emily Mitchell was awake and alert, her eyes scanning the camp and the surrounding area with the desperate vigilance of a captive looking for any chance of escape or rescue. If she saw him too early, if she reacted with surprise or hope, she could wake the men and turn this careful approach into a bloodbath. Takoda needed to reveal himself to her in a way that would make her understand instantly that he was here to help, not to harm. and that silence was essential. He circled around behind the wagon, using its bulk to shield him from the men sleeping around the fire. Emily was on the far side of the wheel, her back to him, her attention focused on her captors. Takoda could see the rope that bound her wrists, thick hemp, tied with rough knots that had left angry red marks on her skin, where she had clearly struggled against them. Her ankles were similarly bound, and another rope connected her to the wagon wheel itself, ensuring she couldn't move more than a few feet in any direction. Takoda pulled his knife from its sheath, the blade whispering against the leather with a sound quieter than a breath. The knife was old, passed down through his family for generations, its edge honed to a razor sharpness that could slice through rope like it was spider silk. He moved closer, now within arm's reach of Emily, close enough to smell the fear and exhaustion radiating from her, close enough to see the slight trembling in her shoulders that spoke of tears she refused to shed in front of her captors. He reached out slowly and placed his hand gently over her mouth, ready to explain, ready to calm her before fear could make her scream. Emily's entire body went rigid, her eyes going wide with terror. But before she could react beyond that initial shock, Takoda leaned close to her ear and whispered 3 words that he knew would change everything. "Sarah sent me." The effect was instantaneous and profound. Emily's body went from rigid terror to trembling relief so quickly that Takoda had to steady her with his free hand. Tears, which she had held back through hours of brutalization and fear, now streamed down her face. But she made no sound, biting down on his palm to stifle the sob that wanted to escape. Her eyes, green as forest moss, even in the harsh morning light, met his with an expression of such desperate hope and gratitude that Takoda felt something crack in the carefully constructed walls around his heart. He slowly removed his hand from her mouth, trusting her to remain silent. Emily immediately whispered, so quietly he had to strain to hear, "Sarah, my daughter, she's alive? She's safe?" Takoda nodded, then put a finger to his lips, indicating the need for absolute silence. He positioned himself behind her, his knife working at the ropes that bound her wrists. The blade cut through the hemp with barely a whisper of sound, and he felt Emily's wrists come free. She immediately brought her hands around, wincing at the pain as blood flow returned to her fingers. Takoda moved to her ankles next, cutting through those bonds with the same careful precision. As he worked, he was acutely aware of the 4 men sleeping just yards away, any one of whom could wake at any moment. The scarred man stirred slightly, muttering something in his sleep, and both Takoda and Emily froze, barely breathing. After a moment, the man settled back into deeper sleep, and Takoda continued his work. The rope connecting Emily to the wagon wheel was the last to go, and as it fell away, she was finally truly free. But freedom meant nothing if they couldn't escape the camp without alerting the outlaws. Takoda gestured for Emily to follow him, keeping low, moving slowly. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this place of horror as fast as her legs could carry her. But she understood that survival depended on silence and stealth. She followed Takoda's lead, mimicking his careful movements, placing her feet where he placed his, using her hands to steady herself when the terrain became tricky. They had made it perhaps 20 yards from the camp, back toward the rocks where Takoda had observed from earlier, when disaster struck. Emily's torn dress, hanging loose and tattered, caught on a low-growing thorny bush. She tried to pull it free quietly, but the fabric was tangled thoroughly, and her gentle tugging only seemed to make it worse. She looked at Takoda with panic in her eyes, and he could see her calculating whether it was worth abandoning the dress entirely and continuing in just her undergarments. Before either of them could make a decision, a voice called out from the camp, "Well, what do we have here?" Takoda turned slowly, deliberately, placing himself between Emily and the voice. It was Donovan, the leader, the one with snake eyes that Sarah had described. He had woken to find his captive missing and had been smart enough to look in the right direction rather than raising an immediate alarm. Now he stood at the edge of the camp, a revolver in his hand, pointed directly at Takoda. The smile on his face was the kind that never reached the eyes, the smile of a predator who had cornered its prey. "Thought you could just walk in and take what's mine, did you?" Donovan said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. The sound woke the other three men, who scrambled for their weapons with the practiced speed of men accustomed to violence. Within seconds, Takoda and Emily found themselves facing four armed men. Their escape attempt turned into a standoff. "She's not yours," Takoda said calmly, his voice carrying an edge of steel that made even Donovan pause. "She's a free woman, and you've committed crimes that will see you hang." Donovan laughed, a sound like gravel being crushed underfoot. "Hang? Out here? You're dreaming, Apache. There's no law out here except what a man makes with his gun and his will. And right now, I'm the law." He gestured with his revolver. "Now you're going to walk back to that camp real slow, and the woman's going to come with you. And then we're going to have a conversation about why you thought it was a good idea to stick your red nose into white man's business." The scarred man had circled around to the side, his rifle trained on Takoda, the big one, muscles bulging under his dirty shirt, had positioned himself to block any escape route back toward where Spirit and Sarah waited. And the fourth one, the one who had laughed while Emily cried, stood with a shotgun that could cut a man in half at this range. They had done this before, Takoda realized, surrounded and captured victims with practiced efficiency. These weren't just opportunists, they were experienced predators. "Last chance," Donovan said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Walk back peaceful, or I'd put a bullet in your head and take the woman anyway. Either way works for me, but I'm giving you a choice. That's more than most get." Takoda looked at Emily, saw the fear in her eyes, but also something else. She was trusting him to find a way out of this, to keep his promise to Sarah, to save them both. It was a heavy weight to carry, heavier than any weapon, heavier than any responsibility he had borne in his years of isolation. For a moment he considered his options, 4 guns against 1, Emily unarmed and weakened from her ordeal. The element of surprise gone. The odds were worse than bad. They were catastrophic. But Takoda had faced bad odds before, had survived situations where survival seemed impossible, and he had learned, through blood and fire and endless desert nights, that the greatest weapon wasn't the gun in your hand or the knife at your belt. It was the willingness to do whatever was necessary, to become what the moment required, to transform from man to force of nature. "All right," Takoda said, raising his hands slowly. "We'll walk back. No need for shooting." He saw Donovan relax slightly, saw the triumph in those snake eyes. The outlaw thought he had won, thought this would end with him still in control, still the predator. He was wrong. As Takoda began to walk forward, his hands still raised, he caught Emily's eyes and gave her the slightest nod. She understood instantly, her body tensing, ready to move. Takoda counted his steps. 1, 2, 3, watching the men's positions, calculating angles and distances. 4, the scarred man lowered his rifle slightly, assuming the threat had passed. 5, the big one shifted his weight, relaxing just a fraction. 6, Donovan's smile grew wider, more confident. 7, Takoda moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a human being, his body exploding into action like a coiled spring suddenly released. His right hand, which had been raised in surrender, snapped forward and threw his knife in a single fluid motion. The blade spun through the air with deadly accuracy, burying itself in the throat of the man with the shotgun, before he could even register what was happening. The shotgun discharged into the ground as the man fell, his death scream cut off by the steel lodged in his windpipe. In the same instant, Takoda dove to the left, his hand reaching for the Colt at his hip. Donovan's shot went wide, the bullet meant for Takoda's chest instead whistling past his ear close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. Takoda rolled, came up on one knee, and fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot caught Donovan in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his revolver. The second shot hit him in the leg, dropping him to the ground with a scream of pain and rage. The scarred man was bringing his rifle to bear when Emily, showing the courage that had kept her alive through this nightmare, threw herself at his legs in a desperate tackle. She couldn't hope to overpower him, but she didn't need to. She just needed to buy Takoda seconds. The man stumbled, his shot going high, and those seconds were all Takoda needed. He fired again, and the scarred man went down with a bullet in his chest, the rifle falling from his hands as he collapsed. That left the big one, and he was fast for his side. He charged at Takoda like a bull, too close for Takoda to get another shot off before impact. They collided with bone-jarring force, and Takoda felt the Colt fly from his hand as they hit the ground together. The big man outweighed him by at least 50 pounds, and he used that weight advantage to pin Takoda down, his massive hands reaching for Takoda's throat. Takoda could feel the crushing pressure as those hands found their grip, cutting off his air. He struck at the man's face, his ribs, anywhere he could reach, but it was like hitting a stone wall. Black spots began to dance at the edges of his vision, and he could hear a roaring in his ears that he knew was his own blood thundering through oxygen-starved veins. This was how it ended, he thought distantly, not in glory, not in a blaze of heroic sacrifice, but suffocated in the dirt by a man whose name he didn't even know. Then Emily was there, Takoda's knife in her hands. She must have pulled it from the dead man's throat. She drove the blade into the big man's back with all her strength, and though it wasn't deep enough to kill instantly, it was enough to make him release his grip and roar in pain. Takoda sucked in a desperate breath and then drove his knee up into the man's groin with savage force. The big man rolled off him, clutching at the knife in his back and the new pain Takoda had delivered. Takoda scrambled to his feet, found his Colt, and pointed it at the big man. For a moment, they locked eyes, hunter and prey, warrior and victim, justice and crime. The big man seemed to understand that his time had come, that the choices he had made had led inevitably to this moment. He stopped reaching for the knife in his back and instead sat back, breathing heavily, blood soaking through his shirt. "Just do it," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Better a bullet than bleeding out slow." Takoda's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Emily's hand on his arm stopped him. He looked at her, surprised. She was trembling, covered in dirt and blood, her dress torn, her face bruised, everything about her speaking of trauma and violation. But her eyes were clear, determined. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not like this. Not in cold blood. We tie him up, take them all to the law, let them hang properly, in front of everyone, so the world knows what they did." Her voice grew stronger. "I want Sarah to see that justice exists, that good can triumph over evil, through the law, not just through violence. Please." Takoda looked owlily to the wounded man, then to Donovan, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder and leg, his snake eyes now filled with pain and fear. The scarred man was dead, the laughing one was dead, but these two could be brought to face civilized justice. It would be harder, more dangerous, but Emily was right. There was power in doing this the right way, in showing Sarah that the world still had order and law, and consequences for evil deeds. "All right," Takoda said finally, lowering his weapon but keeping it ready. "We do it your way." He looked at Emily with something approaching respect. "You're braver than most men I've known." Emily managed a weak smile. "I'm a mother. Bravery comes with the job." Then her knees buckled as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the fight suddenly drained away. Takoda caught her before she could fall, steadying her gently. "Rest," he told her. "I'll secure the prisoners. Then we'll get you to your daughter." At the mention of Sarah, tears filled Emily's eyes again, but these were tears of joy mixed with the exhaustion and trauma of her ordeal. "She's safe," Takoda assured her. "Scared, exhausted, but alive and safe. She's the bravest 10-year-old I've ever met." "She's her father's daughter," Emily said softly, then corrected herself. And mine. We don't break easy, the Mitchell women. As Takoda set about binding the two surviving outlaws with their own ropes, using knots they would never escape, he found himself thinking about families, about mothers and daughters, about the bonds that could drive a child to run through a killing desert and a stranger to risk his life, for people he'd never met. He had tried to cut himself off from such conscience, had believed that isolation was safety, that caring was weakness. But looking at Emily, battered but unbroken, thinking of Sarah waiting anxiously with spirit, Takoda realized that perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps the human connections he had fled from were not chains that bound, but threads that gave meaning to survival. Perhaps being the ghost had not protected him, but had simply made him less than what he could be. The sun was fully risen now, bathing the Badlands in harsh light that exposed every rock, every shadow, every truth that the night had hidden. And in that light, Takoda saw clearly what came next. They would take the prisoners to the nearest town, would let the law have its due, and then he would have to decide who Takoda was going to be, the ghost who walked alone, or the man whose name meant friend to everyone. But those were thoughts for later. Now there was still work to be done. The walk back to where Sarah waited felt longer than the entire night's ride had been. Emily's legs trembled with each step, her body finally registering the full extent of her ordeal now that the immediate danger had passed. Takoda supported her with one arm while keeping his rifle ready in the other, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding terrain. The two surviving outlaws stumbled ahead of them, their hands bound behind their backs and connected by a rope that Takoda held like a leash. Donovan cursed with every step, his wounded shoulder and leg making the journey excruciating, while the big man remained silent, perhaps contemplating the gallows that awaited him. They had left the bodies of the two dead outlaws where they had fallen. Takoda had searched them first, finding a handful of coins and a tarnished pocket watch that he suspected had been stolen from some previous victim. These he tucked away, evidence for the trial that would come. The desert would take care of the bodies, the sun and scavengers, reducing them to bones that would eventually be buried by shifting sand. It was more than they deserved, but Takoda had no desire to waste time or energy on burial when living souls needed his attention. As they crested the rise where Takoda had left Sarah and Spirit, he saw the girl standing on a rock, her small frame silhouetted against the morning sky as she watched their approach. The moment she recognized her mother, she let out a cry that was half sob, half scream, and launched herself down the slope with reckless abandon. Emily broke free from Takoda's supporting arm and ran to meet her daughter, and the two collided in an embrace that seemed to pour out all the fear, all the love, all the desperate hope that had sustained them both through the longest night of their lives. Takoda hung back, giving them their moment, keeping watch over the prisoners while mother and daughter wept in each other's arms. He saw Emily's hands running over Sarah's face, her hair, her arms, as if needing physical confirmation that her child was real, was whole, was alive. Sarah clung to her mother with a strength that seemed impossible for such a small person, her face buried in Emily's chest, her small body shaking with sobs that had been held back for too long. "I thought they killed you," Sarah gasped, between sobs. "I thought I'd never see you again." "Shh, baby. I'm here. I'm here," Emily murmured, stroking her daughter's tangled blonde hair. "We're both here. We're both alive." She looked over Sarah's head at Takoda, and the gratitude in her eyes was almost painful to witness. "Thanks to Mr. Takoda." Sarah pulled back from her mother just enough to look at the Apache warrior who had saved them both. Then, before Takoda could react, she ran to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, hugging him with the same fierce intensity she had shown her mother. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for bringing my mama back." Takoda stood awkwardly, uncertain how to respond to this display of affection. His arms hovered at his sides for a moment, before slowly, carefully, he rested one hand on the child's head in a gesture that was almost a benediction. "You're welcome, little one," he said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't quite name. You were very brave. We both were, Sarah said, pulling back to look up at him. You and me, we were brave together. Donovan chose that moment to spit on the ground and sneer. How touching. The savage and the brat, playing heroes. You think this matters? You think anyone's going to care what happened to a widow and her whelp out in the middle of nowhere? His snake eyes fixed on Takoda with pure hatred. They'll probably give us medals for trying to civilize you, for trying to... The words cut off with a gasp, as Takoda moved with lightning speed, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides. He grabbed Donovan by his shirt, front and lifted him almost off his feet, despite the man's wounded leg making him unable to stand properly. You will speak with respect, in front of the child, Takoda said quietly, but his voice carried a threat that made even the big man take a step back. Or I will remind you that my promise to bring you to justice alive did not include bringing you comfortable. He released Donovan, who crumpled to the ground, his face pale with pain and fear. The outlaw leader seemed to understand, finally, that he was no longer in control, that the natural order he had assumed, white over red, strong over weak, cruel over kind, had been inverted, and his life now rested in the hands of a man he had underestimated catastrophically. Emily had pulled Sarah back to her, shielding her daughter's eyes from the confrontation, but Sarah had seen enough of adult cruelty in the past day to understand what was happening. Will they really hang? She asked her mother quietly. Will they really pay for what they did? Emily hesitated, then decided that honesty was better than false comfort. If the law works the way it should, yes, they'll stand trial and a jury will decide their fate. But sometimes, she paused, searching for the right word. Sometimes justice takes time, and sometimes it doesn't look the way we expect. But we'll do everything we can to make sure what they did to us, what they did to others, is known and punished. I'll testify, Sarah said with fierce determination. I'll tell everyone what I saw, what they did. I'm not scared of them anymore. Takoda, listening to this exchange while keeping watch over the prisoners, felt a surge of pride in the child's courage. She had every right to be broken by what she had witnessed, every reason to want to forget and move on. But instead, she was choosing to stand up, to speak out, to be part of the justice she sought. It reminded him of why he had once believed in law, in community, in the bonds that held civilization together. We need to move, he said, interrupting the moment reluctantly. The nearest town with a proper sheriff is Copper Springs, about a day's ride from here. We can make it by nightfall if we don't delay. He looked at Emily's exhausted face and Sarah's small frame and reconsidered. Or we can make camp halfway, let you both rest properly. The prisoners aren't going anywhere. Emily shook her head. No, I want this over. I want them behind bars, away from us. I want to sleep without wondering if they'll escape and come for us. She managed a weak smile. Besides, Sarah tells me you only have 1 horse. We can't very well make our captors walk the whole way while we ride. The prisoners walk, Takoda said flatly. Their comfort is not my concern. You and Sarah will ride Spirit. I'll walk alongside. That's not fair to you, Emily protested. You've already done so much. Takoda's expression softened slightly. Fairness would be leaving them for the desert to claim. Justice is bringing them to face the law. And honor is ensuring you and your daughter are safe and cared for. I choose honor, he began, gathering his meager supplies, preparing for the long journey ahead. Besides, I've walked farther in worse conditions. This is nothing. What Takoda didn't say was that walking would give him time to think, to process what had happened and what it meant for the path he had chosen. For 5 years he had lived with ghosts, had existed in a limbo between life and death. But in the span of one night, a child's plea had pulled him back into the world of the living, back into a place where his actions mattered, where justice and honor and sacrifice had meaning beyond mere survival. They set out as the sun climbed higher, transforming the Badlands into a furnace of heat and light. Emily and Sarah rode double on Spirit, the paint stallion accepting the extra burden with patient grace. The two prisoners walked ahead, connected by rope, with Takoda following close behind, his rifle always ready, his eyes always watchful. The journey was slow and arduous, the heat beating down on them mercilessly, but no one complained. Emily and Sarah because they were simply grateful to be alive and together. The prisoners because they knew complaint would gain them nothing but harsher treatment. And Takoda because hardship was simply the price of doing what was right. As they walked, Sarah began to talk, her child's need to process trauma through storytelling overcoming her exhaustion. She told her mother about running through the desert, about the fear and the heat, and the certainty that she would die. She spoke of seeing Takoda's fire, of the desperate hope that drove her forward when her body wanted to collapse. And she described the moment she realized he was going to help, the relief that flooded through her when she understood she wasn't alone anymore. Emily listened, holding her daughter close, occasionally pressing kisses to the top of Sarah's head. Sometimes her eyes would fill with tears at particularly harrowing parts of the tale, but she never interrupted, letting Sarah release the poison of her experience through words. Takoda, walking behind them, found himself part of the story, hearing himself described as a hero, a savior, when he still thought of himself as simply a man who had done what needed to be done. Around midday, they stopped briefly at a small spring Takoda knew, letting everyone drink and rest. Emily used the opportunity to wash some of the grime from her face and Sarah's, while Takoda kept the prisoners under watch. Donovan's wounds had stopped bleeding, but infection was a real possibility, and the big man's knife wound was clearly causing him significant pain. Part of Takoda, the part that had lived alone for 5 years, that had hardened into something cold and merciless, thought they deserved whatever suffering came to them. But another part, the part that was slowly reawakening, felt a twinge of something that might have been compassion. He settled for cleaning their wounds with water from the spring and tearing strips from his own spare shirt to bind them properly. "Why?" Donovan asked, his voice thick with suspicion and pain. "Why help us at all?" Takoda didn't answer immediately, focusing on tying off the makeshift bandage. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, thoughtful, "Because I was taught that even enemies deserve basic human dignity. Because I've seen what happens when men become monsters, and I refuse to join them in that darkness." He met Donovan's eyes, and because those two, he gestured toward Emily and Sarah, deserve to see that justice doesn't require becoming what we fight against. Donovan laughed bitterly. "Noble words from a savage. Let's see how noble you feel when we're standing in front of a judge in Copper Springs. Let's see whose word gets believed, yours and a widow's, or ours." The big man spoke for the first time since his capture. "Shut up, Donovan. Just shut up." He looked at Takoda with weary resignation. "He's right, you know. We'll hang, and we deserve it. I've done things that keep me awake at night. This," he gestured to his bound hands, his wounded back, "this is mercy compared to what we deserve." The confession hung in the air, stark and honest. Takoda nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of it. "Then face it with whatever dignity you have left. Die like a man, not like a coward making excuses." They continued their journey through the afternoon heat, the landscape gradually changing as they left the deepest parts of the Badlands behind. The red rocks gave way to scrubby grasslands, and occasional clusters of cottonwood trees marked the presence of underground water. Signs of civilization began to appear. Old campfire rings, wagon ruts from previous travelers, even a weathered grave marker with a name too faded to read. Sarah had fallen asleep against her mother's back, exhausted by the emotional release of telling her story and the physical demands of the journey. Emily dozed as well, swaying gently with Spirit's steady gait, trusting the horse and Takoda to keep them safe. For the first time in what felt like years, her face was peaceful, the lines of stress and fear smoothed away by sleep's healing touch. Takoda found his thoughts drifting as he walked, memories bubbling up from the depths where he had tried to bury them. He thought of his own daughter, who would have been about Sarah's age now if she had lived. He remembered teaching her to ride, her delighted laughter as he swung her onto the horse's back. He remembered his wife's smile, the way she had looked at him with love and pride, and he remembered the smoke, the screaming, the day when everything he loved had been taken from him in fire and blood and senseless violence. For 5 years, he had run from those memories, had tried to become someone who couldn't be hurt because he had nothing left to lose. But watching Emily and Sarah, seeing the bond between mother and daughter, something in him was shifting. The wall he had built around his heart was developing cracks, and through those cracks, light was beginning to seep in. It was painful, this reawakening of feeling, but it was also strangely liberating. For the first time in 5 years, Takoda felt truly alive. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, they crested a rise and saw Copper Springs spread out in the valley below. It was a modest town, perhaps 300 souls, clustered around a genuine spring that fed a small creek. The main street boasted a general store, a saloon, a church, and most importantly a sheriff's office, with a sturdy-looking jail attached. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer rang out across the valley. Civilization, law, justice, and for Takoda, the first real test of whether the world he had left behind would honor the sacrifice he had made to bring these criminals to face their punishment. Emily woke as they descended toward the town, gently rousing Sarah. Both mother and daughter sat up straighter, preparing themselves for the next ordeal, explaining what had happened, reliving the trauma in official statements, facing the possibility that justice might not be as swift or certain as they hoped. "Whatever happens in there," Takoda said quietly, "know that you both showed more courage than most adults could muster. You survived, you fought back, and you refused to let evil triumph. That matters, regardless of what any court decides." Emily reached down from the saddle and squeezed his shoulder briefly. "We couldn't have done it without you. Whatever they say, whatever happens, you gave us our lives back. We won't forget that." As they entered Copper Springs, people stopped what they were doing to stare. The sight of an Apache warrior leading 2 bound and wounded white men, followed by a woman and child on horseback, was unusual enough to draw attention. Whispers followed in their wake, and Takoda could feel the weight of judgment, suspicion, and curiosity pressing down on them. He kept his expression neutral, his bearing proud but not threatening. He had nothing to apologize for, nothing to hide. The sheriff emerged from his office as they approached, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but Takoda could see the tension in his shoulders, the readiness to draw if necessary. "What's all this?" the sheriff asked, his voice carefully neutral. Takoda stopped, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "These men are wanted for kidnapping, theft, assault, and murder. They attacked this woman and her daughter, stole their belongings, and killed 2 of their own when I freed the prisoners. The bodies are in the Badlands, about a day's ride northwest. I'm bringing them to face justice." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, taking in the scene, the bound men, Emily's torn dress and bruised face, Sarah's exhausted but determined expression, and Takoda himself, standing tall and unarmed except for the rifle slung over his shoulder. "That's quite a story," he said slowly. "I'm going to need to hear it from everyone involved, separately, and I'll need to verify your claims." "Of course," Emily said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "We'll tell you everything. But please, Sheriff, my daughter and I need rest, medical attention and safety. Whatever investigation you need to conduct, please do it. But these men are dangerous, and they shouldn't be allowed to escape justice." The sheriff studied her face, then Sarah's, and something in their expressions seemed to convince him that this was not a simple matter of conflicting claims. "All right," he said finally. I'll lock these two up while we sort this out. Ma'am, you and your daughter can rest at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson will take good care of you. And you, he turned to Takoda, you'll need to stay where I can find you until I've investigated your claims. I'll be at the saloon, Takoda said, or making camp on the edge of town. I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved. As the sheriff and his deputy took custody of Donovan and the big man, leading them toward the jail, Sarah suddenly jumped down from spirit and ran to Takoda. She hugged him again, fierce and quick, then looked up at him, with eyes that seemed far older than her 10 years. Don't leave without saying goodbye, she said. Promise me. Takoda knelt down so they were eye to eye. I promise, he said solemnly. I'll stay until the trial, until justice is done. And when it's time to go, I'll say goodbye properly. Sarah nodded, satisfied, and returned to her mother. Emily and Takoda's eyes met over the child's head, and in that moment, 1,000 unspoken things passed between them. Gratitude, respect, understanding, and perhaps something more, something neither was quite ready to name or acknowledge. Then the moment passed, and Emily turned to follow the sheriff's directions to the boarding house, Sarah's hand firmly in hers. Takoda watched them go, feeling strangely bereft as they disappeared from sight. He had fulfilled his promise, had brought Emily back to her daughter, had delivered the criminals to justice. His obligation was complete, so why did it feel like his journey was just beginning? The trial began 3 days later in the small courthouse that doubled as the town hall. In those 3 days, Copper Springs had transformed from a quiet frontier town into a hub of activity and gossip. News of the kidnapping, the rescue, and the dramatic capture had spread like wildfire through the territory. Reporters from as far as Phoenix and Tucson had arrived, sensing a story that would captivate readers. A lone Apache warrior saving a widow and child from ruthless outlaws, delivering frontier justice with honor and courage. Takoda had spent those days in a small room above the saloon, venturing out only for meals and to check on Spirit. He avoided the curious stares and whispered questions, the endless requests for interviews and dramatic retellings. The attention made him deeply uncomfortable, reminded him too much of a life he had tried to leave behind. He was not a hero, seeking glory, just a man who had done what needed to be done. But he had kept his promise to Sarah, checking in daily at the boarding house where Emily and the child were recovering. Each visit was brief, proper, chaperoned by Mrs. Henderson's watchful presence. But in those short moments, Takoda had watched Emily grow stronger, the haunted look in her eyes slowly fading as rest and safety worked their healing magic. Sarah, resilient in the way children could be, seemed to bounce back even faster, though she clung to her mother with an intensity that spoke of deep trauma still being processed. On the second day, the sheriff had returned from the Badlands with a grim expression and confirmation of Takoda's story. He had found the 2 bodies exactly where described, had recovered evidence of the attack on Emily and Sarah's wagon, and had pieced together enough of the truth to validate every word of their testimony. Donovan and his surviving accomplice faced charges of kidnapping, assault, theft, conspiracy to murder, and accessory to murder. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Now, as Takoda sat in the packed courtroom, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. He wore his best clothes, buckskin pants cleaned and brushed, a new shirt Emily had insisted on buying him despite his protests, his long hair tied back neatly. He looked every inch the dignified warrior, proud and unbowed by the scrutiny surrounding him. Emily sat across the aisle, with Sarah pressed close to her side. She wore a borrowed dress, dark blue and modest, that Mrs. Henderson had provided. Her bruises had faded to yellow-green shadows, and her hair was neatly arranged. But it was her bearing that struck everyone who saw her. The straight spine, the lifted chin, the quiet dignity of a woman who had survived horror and refused to be broken by it. Sarah, in a simple white dress, looked small and young, but her eyes held a determination that made her seem far older. The judge, A stern-faced man named Whitmore, who had traveled from the territorial capital specifically for this trial, called the court to order. The room fell silent immediately, the gravity of the proceedings settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. This was not just about four criminals and their victims. This was about whether justice could truly exist in the wild frontier, whether the law meant anything beyond the reach of established civilization. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. The sheriff testified about what he had found in the Badlands, the bodies, the abandoned wagon, the evidence of violent struggle. A doctor testified about Emily's injuries, the bruises and rope burns that spoke of brutal treatment. And then Emily herself took the stand. Takoda watched as she walked to the witness box, her steps measured and calm. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice clear and unwavering. Then, under the prosecutor's gentle questioning, she began to tell her story. She spoke of hiring the four men to escort her and Sarah to Phoenix, of their initial courtesy that had masked darker intentions. She described the moment everything changed, when Donovan had grabbed her and the others had revealed their true nature. Her voice remained steady as she recounted the hours of terror, the degradation and fear, the desperate hope that her daughter had escaped. She didn't spare herself or sanitize the horror. She wanted the jury, wanted everyone in that courtroom to understand exactly what these men had done. And when she described hearing Sarah scream at her to run, when she spoke of watching her 10-year-old daughter flee into the desert while she could do nothing to protect her, that was when her composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down Emily's face, but she didn't look away from the jury. She let them see her pain, her mother's anguish at being separated from her child in such horrific circumstances. "I thought she was dead," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I thought the desert would take her, that I would never see my daughter again. That was worse than anything they did to me, the thought that Sarah had died alone and afraid because of the choice I made to trust these men." The courtroom was utterly silent except for the sound of quiet weeping from several of the women present. Even the judge's stern expression had softened slightly. Emily took a moment to compose herself, then continued, "But my daughter is stronger than I knew. She survived. She found help. And she saved both of us by bringing Takoda to our rescue." When it was the defense attorney's turn to cross-examine a weaselly little man named Hutchins, who had reluctantly accepted the case only because the law required it, he tried to suggest that Emily had perhaps misunderstood the men's intentions, that maybe what happened was a tragic misunderstanding rather than deliberate crime. Emily's response was swift and devastating. "There was no misunderstanding," she said, her voice cold as ice. "When a man tears a woman's clothes, when he ties her up and throws her in a wagon like cargo, when he laughs while she begs for her child's life, there is no room for misunderstanding. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they would have killed me when they were done if Takoda hadn't stopped them." Hutchins, realizing he was only making things worse, quickly ended his questioning. Sarah was called next, and the courtroom held its collective breath as the small girl climbed into the witness box, her feet barely touching the floor even when she sat down. The judge ordered a cushion brought so she could be seen properly, and Sarah sat up straight, looking far braver than any 10-year-old should have to be. Under gentle questioning, Sarah told her story. She spoke clearly, factually, describing what she had seen with the precise detail of a child's observant nature. When she reached the part about running through the desert, about the heat and fear and certainty that she would die, her voice wavered, but she pushed through, describing her desperate decision to run toward the smoke of a distant campfire, toward the hope of rescue that might not even exist. "And then I saw him," Sarah said, her eyes finding Takoda across the courtroom. "Mr. Takoda, sitting by his fire, and I knew he would help me. I knew he was a good man, even though I'd never met him before. I could just tell." "How could you tell?" the prosecutor asked gently. Sarah thought about this for a moment, because when I asked for help, he didn't turn me away. He didn't ask what was in it for him, or whether helping was convenient, or whether my mama was worth saving. He just helped. That's what good people do. They help when someone needs it, even if it's hard, even if it's dangerous. The simple wisdom of the child's words hung in the air. Several jury members nodded, their eyes moving from Sarah to Takoda with new understanding. Here was not just a warrior seeking glory, or an outsider looking to prove himself, but simply a man who had acted on his principles when called upon. When Hutchins tried to cross-examine Sarah, suggesting that maybe in her fear and exhaustion she had misremembered details, Sarah looked at him with an expression that would have been comical if the circumstances weren't so serious. "I remember everything," she said firmly. "Every word they said, every terrible thing they did. I remember because I couldn't stop it, couldn't help my mama, and it made me so angry and scared that it's burned into my brain forever. I wish I could forget, but I can't. And I won't lie about what I saw just because it makes people uncomfortable." The defense attorney wisely retreated, and Sarah was allowed to step down. She walked back to her mother with her head held high, and when she passed Takoda's seat, she reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes about the bond that had formed between the warrior and the child he had saved. Then it was Takoda's turn to testify. He walked to the witness box with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements, aware that many in the courtroom were seeing an Apache man this close for the first time. He could feel their prejudice, their preconceptions, their doubts about whether his testimony could be trusted. But he had faced worse things than judgment, and he was determined to speak his truth, regardless of how it was received. The prosecutor led him through his account: Sarah's arrival at his camp, the desperate plea for help, the night ride to track the outlaws, the careful reconnaissance, and finally the rescue and confrontation. Takoda spoke plainly without embellishment or drama. He didn't try to make himself sound more heroic or the outlaws more villainous than the facts warranted. He simply told what happened, trusting the truth to speak for itself. When he described freeing Emily and their attempted escape, he saw her eyes fill with tears again. When he recounted the fight, the deaths of 2 outlaws and the wounding of the others, he felt the courtroom tense. But when he explained Emily's insistence on bringing the survivors to face proper justice rather than frontier execution, he saw understanding dawn on many faces. "She could have let me kill them," Takoda said, his dark eyes sweeping across the jury. "After what they did to her, after what she suffered, she would have been justified, but she chose the harder path, the path of law and civilization and proper justice. That choice, more than anything I did, is the real story here. A woman who had every reason to want revenge chose mercy and justice instead." Hutchins's cross-examination was more aggressive with Takoda than it had been with Emily or Sarah. He tried to suggest that Takoda had killed the 2 outlaws unnecessarily, that perhaps he had been looking for an excuse for violence. He implied that an Apache warrior couldn't be trusted, that his testimony might be colored by hatred of white men or desire for recognition. Takoda listened to these accusations with calm patience, then responded with devastating simplicity. "I killed 2 men because they were trying to kill me and the woman I was protecting. One had a shotgun pointed at us. The other was firing a rifle. I did not seek their deaths. I sought to stop them from causing more harm. As for my motivations, I want nothing from this court or this town except to see justice done. I helped because a child asked me to, because it was right, because I could not live with myself if I had turned away from such desperate need." He paused, then added, "You question my honor because of my race, but I kept my word to a frightened child. I risked my life for strangers, and I brought criminals to face the law rather than taking easier revenge. If that is not honor, if that is not worthy of trust, then I do not know what is." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of applause and angry muttering. The judge banged his gavel for order, but even he seemed moved by Takoda's words. When quiet was restored, the prosecutor rested his case, and the defense, having no real counter to the mountain of evidence and compelling testimony, rested as well after putting the two defendants on the stand, where they proceeded to damn themselves further with their arrogant, unrepentant attitudes. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, their faces grim but certain, the foreman stood and delivered their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The words echoed through the courthouse, and Emily closed her eyes in relief, while Sarah gripped her mother's hand tightly. Justice, it seemed, could still exist on the frontier. Judge Whitmore sentenced both men to death by hanging, to be carried out within the week. As the guards led them away, Donovan turned to Takoda with pure hatred in his eyes. "This isn't over," he hissed. "There are others like us, and they'll remember what you did. You'd better watch your back, savage." Takoda met his gaze calmly. "I've been watching my back for many years, and men like you always threaten revenge. They cannot deliver. Face your death with whatever dignity you have left, because your words mean nothing to me." As the prisoners were removed, the courtroom gradually emptied. Emily and Sarah were surrounded by well-wishers and reporters, but Emily's eyes kept returning to where Takoda stood apart, watching the crowd with the detached expression of a man who didn't quite belong to this world of civilization and law. Finally, she excused herself and made her way to him, Sarah following close behind. "It's over," Emily said, her voice filled with relief and exhaustion. "Justice was done. Thanks to you." Takoda shook his head. "Thanks to Sarah's courage in finding me, and your strength in surviving. Thanks to the law working as it should. I was simply the instrument." Sarah tugged on his sleeve, and when he looked down at her, she said, "You promised you wouldn't leave without saying goodbye. You're not leaving yet, are you?" The simple question cut through all of Takoda's carefully constructed walls. He had been planning to leave that night, to disappear back into the wilderness before the town's attention became overwhelming. But looking at Sarah's hopeful face, at Emily's quiet plea in her green eyes, he found he couldn't simply vanish like the ghost he had been for so long. "I'll stay a few more days," he said. "Make sure everything is truly settled, that you're both safe." Over the next 3 days, as the town prepared for the hanging and then executed the sentence with grim efficiency, Takoda found himself spending more and more time with Emily and Sarah. They took meals together at the boarding house, walked the streets of Copper Springs, talked about everything and nothing. Emily told him about her life before coming west, about her husband's dreams of building something new, about Sarah's childhood in greener lands. Sarah peppered him with questions about tracking, about survival in the desert, about his horse Spirit, and whether he ever got lonely living by himself. And slowly, carefully, Takoda found himself telling them things he had never spoken of about his own family. Lost to violence, about the years of wandering and isolation, about the man he had been before becoming the ghost. Emily listened with compassion but without pity, understanding that some wounds were too deep for sympathy alone to heal. Sarah listened with a child's acceptance, simply glad to know more about the man who had saved her mother, and in doing so, saved her whole world. On the 4th day after the trial, as Takoda prepared Spirit for departure, Emily came to him with a proposition. "Sarah and I are going to Phoenix as planned," she said. "I still want to open that boarding house, build the life we came west to find. But," she paused, gathering her courage, "but we'd like you to come with us, not as a guard or an employee, but as a friend, as family, if you'd accept that." Takoda stared at her, his carefully neutral expression cracking to show his astonishment. I don't belong in that world, in civilization. I'm a man of the wilderness, Emily. I wouldn't fit into your new life." "You don't have to fit," Emily said gently. "You just have to be willing to try. Sarah needs a good man in her life, someone to teach her the strength and honor you've shown us. And she hesitated, then pushed forward. "I need someone who understands that strength isn't just about surviving, but about choosing to live fully despite the pain of the past." Sarah appeared at her mother's side, having clearly been listening from nearby. "Please, Takoda," she said, using his name without the formal mist for the first time. "Please come with us. We're family now. Families should stay together." Takoda looked from mother to daughter, seeing in their faces not just hope, but genuine love. He thought about the years of isolation, the careful cultivation of emotional distance that had protected him from further pain. He thought about the man his wife had loved, the father his daughter had adored, the warrior who had fought for his people and his principles. And he realized that somewhere in the past days, in the act of saving these two people, he had saved himself as well. "I don't know if I can be what you need," he said honestly. "I'm broken in ways that may never fully heal." "We're all broken," Emily said softly, reaching out to take his hand. "We've all suffered losses that changed us forever. But maybe broken people can help each other heal. Maybe that's what family really is. People who see your cracks and your scars and love you anyway." Sarah grabbed his other hand. "Besides, you promised to teach me to track like you do. You can't break a promise to a 10-year-old. That's like against the rules or something." Despite himself, Takoda felt a smile tugging at his lips, the first real smile in 5 years. "Is that so?" he asked, looking down at the child who had changed everything. "Absolutely," Sarah said, with complete seriousness. "Very serious rules. You'd be in big trouble." Takoda looked at Spirit, his faithful companion through years of solitude, then back at Emily and Sarah. He thought about Phoenix, about a boarding house full of strangers, about learning to live among people again. It terrified him in ways that facing armed outlaws never had. But perhaps, he thought, perhaps courage isn't just about facing physical danger. Perhaps real courage was about risking your heart, about choosing connection over isolation, about believing that love could exist even after loss. "All right," he said quietly, the word feeling like both a surrender and a victory. "I'll come with you. I'll try." Sarah whooped with joy and threw her arms around him, and after a moment's hesitation, Emily joined the embrace. Takoda stood there, surrounded by this instant family he had never expected, never sought, but somehow desperately needed. His arms came up to hold them both, and for the first time in 5 years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of human connection, the joy and the fear, the hope and the vulnerability, the beautiful, terrifying possibility of loving and being loved. As they stood there in the morning sun, in the dusty street of a small frontier town, Takoda felt something shift deep within him. The ghost was finally laid to rest. The warrior was finding peace. And the man, the simple, flawed, hopeful man, beneath all the titles and roles, was learning to live again. 3 days later, they left Copper Springs together. Emily and Sarah rode in a new wagon, purchased with money recovered from the outlaws. Takoda rode Spirit alongside them, still watchful, still protective, but no longer separate from the world. As they traveled toward Phoenix and whatever future awaited them there, Sarah chatted happily about the boarding house they would build, about the room that would be Takoda's, about teaching him to bake bread if he would teach her to track. Emily drove the wagon with capable hands, occasionally glancing over at Takoda with a small smile that spoke of possibilities neither was quite ready to name, but both were beginning to believe. And Takoda, looking at this unlikely family that had claimed him as their own, realized that Sarah had been right from the beginning. His name meant friend to everyone, and perhaps it was time to live up to that meaning again. The frontier stretched before them, vast and challenging and full of opportunity. There would be hardships ahead. Building a new life was never easy. There would be moments when Takoda would struggle with the confines of civilization, when the call of the wild places would whisper for him to return to isolation. There would be prejudice to face, obstacles to overcome, and the ever-present shadows of loss to navigate. But for the first time in 5 years, Takoda was not alone. For the first time since tragedy had shattered his world, he had a reason to hope. And as the sun climbed higher in the endless Arizona sky, casting its light on the small caravan heading toward Phoenix, it illuminated not just the road ahead, but the possibility of redemption, healing, and love. Years later, when people asked Emily and Sarah about their journey west, about the terrifying ordeal and miraculous rescue that had defined their lives, They would tell the story with pride and gratitude. They would speak of a brave little girl who refused to give up, of a strong mother who survived the unsurvivable, and of an Apache warrior who proved that honor, courage, and compassion knew no boundaries of race or circumstance. But most of all, they would speak of how a family was born not from blood or tradition, but from the simple choice to love and be loved, to help and be helped, to see in each other not what was lost, but what could still be found. And Takoda, who had once been the ghost, who had once believed himself beyond redemption or connection, would look at Emily and Sarah, his family, and know that sometimes the greatest rescue was not of others, but of yourself. That sometimes the truest justice was not found in punishment, but in healing. And that sometimes the most important promise you could keep was not to a frightened child in the desert, but to yourself. The promise to live fully, love deeply, and never again surrender to the darkness when light still existed in the world. The boarding house they built in Phoenix became known throughout the territory as a place of safety and welcome, where travelers of all races and backgrounds found clean rooms, good food, and genuine hospitality. Sarah grew up strong and proud, learning to track from Takoda and to run a business from her mother, eventually becoming a pioneering woman doctor who served the diverse communities of the growing Southwest. Emily found not just survival but true happiness, her boarding house becoming a home not just for travelers but for a man who had once lost everything and found it again in the most unexpected way. And Takoda, the warrior who had become a ghost and then become a man again, found peace in the daily rhythms of family life, in teaching Sarah the old ways while learning from Emily the new ones, in building something permanent after years of wandering. He never forgot the pain of his past, the losses that had shaped him, but he learned to carry them not as burdens that isolated him, but as experiences that deepened his compassion and strengthened his commitment to protecting others from similar suffering. On quiet evenings, when the guests were settled and Sarah was tucked into bed, Emily and Takoda would sit together on the porch, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of crimson and gold. Sometimes they would talk about the day's events, about plans for the future, about the small victories and challenges of their shared life. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, two survivors who had found shelter in each other's presence. And always, before they turned in for the night, they would look in on Sarah, sleeping peacefully in her bed, safe and loved, and free from the nightmares that could have defined her life. In those moments, Takoda would remember a terrified child running toward his fire, would remember the promise he had made, and would feel grateful that fate had given him the chance to keep it. For in saving Emily and Sarah, he had saved himself. In protecting them, he had found his own protection, and in becoming part of their family, he had discovered what his mother had known when she named him, that being a friend to everyone, including yourself, was perhaps the greatest strength of all. The desert wind would blow gently across Phoenix, carrying whispers of the past and promises of the future. And in a modest boarding house on the edge of town, a family would sleep peacefully, bound together not by blood, but by something stronger, the choice to love, to heal, and to never again face the world's darkness alone.